The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I'm your host, Len B.A. My guest today is Samuel C. Spitale. Samuel Spitale is the author of How to Win the War on Truth, an illustrated guide to how mistruths are sold, why they stick, and how to reclaim reality. He's an LA-based writer, storyteller, and media studies expert with degrees in advertising and media management, who's written for Huffington Post, Geek Magazine, Star Wars Insider, and Advocate.com. He's a member of American Mensa and the Hollywood Radio and Television Society Associates. Samuel Spitale, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
You know, I've interviewed a number of authors on this program, and rarely do I finish the book before the interview, but this one just grabbed me so much. You've formatted the book like a graphic novel. It's packed with information. I love how it has characters and sidebars and visual aids and charts and graphs and satirical cartoons. Did you start off intending to use a lot of graphics?
Well, I knew there needed to be an illustrated component to the book because of the critical thinking learning tool that I use. And I knew I wanted to include lots of visual representations, in charts and graphs to convey information. So it was a more concise way to convey a lot of information. And the publisher and I agreed that having it fully illustrated versus spot illustrations was probably the way to go, and really enable the material to reach the broadest possible audience. It's become kind of a trend to turn a lot of these academic nonfiction books into graphic novels these days, like *Sapiens* and *Lies My Teacher Told Me* is getting a graphic version. And anyway, so we kind of thought we would just go straight to the graphic version, and to make it more entertaining. And the illustrations also provide a much needed dose of humor and whimsy, which I really wanted in the book. So. Yeah,
super valuable. It really helps carry it along. How was it collaborating with your illustrator, Alan Wincup?
It was great. A mutual friend introduced us, and Alan was great. We were communicating constantly, trying to get all of the art just right. And so, it was great. And I think the art came out great. I really like the sense of humor that comes across, in the illustrations. It's kind of political, cartoonish, but kind of a very modern sensibility too. So, I loved it. It's fun just to leaf through and look at the pictures, as they say. You open the book with an example of how a real event gets spun to produce a certain public perception. And the example you used is the case of Stella Liebeck, the 79-year-old woman who sued McDonald's after she suffered third-degree burns when the coffee she ordered spilled in her lap. And I wondered if you could tell us about that incident and the way it was used to sway public opinion. Sure. So what happened was, the 79-year-old woman was driven to McDonald's by her grandson. She got a coffee. They pulled over in the parking lot to add cream and sugar. And the coffee was so hot, the cup literally collapsed in her lap. She went to the emergency room, where she was hospitalized for 8 days and went into shock when it first happened. The coffee was so hot, it was between 180 and 190 degrees. So for comparison, a Keurig is around 120 to 140 degrees, and water boils at 212 degrees. So it was way closer to boiling water than it was a Keurig coffee. And she burned more than 16% of her body. She was disabled for 2 years, left permanently disfigured. You can actually, Google the images online and see the skin grafting that she had done, and they're pretty horrific to look at. They're pretty serious looking. So Liebeck sued McDonald's for $11,000 just to cover her medical expenses that Medicare wouldn't cover. She tried to settle out of court, but McDonald's refused. And McDonald's had already paid out like 700 claims for their hot coffee in the preceding years. So this wasn't, a newsflash for them. But as this was playing out, companies like Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, and other manufacturers of hazardous products seized the opportunity to manipulate public opinion to make us think that this lawsuit was frivolous, as if it were the victim's fault. And most of us didn't really know the ins and outs of the story, so it's easy to just to buy into that. And so they use this misinformation to push through tort reform in the 90s, which was an initiative to lower the payouts of big business when customers are injured with their products. And, and a perfect example is the McDonald's coffee. But in other, industries or in other experiences, like let's say if you lost a limb on the job, that injury could potentially cost, $5 to $10 million in damages over the course of your life if you're not able to work again. But the state could reduce the payout to the cap of 250,000, which is what states were doing, like what George, W. Bush did in Texas. So that when consumers would sue these companies for malpractice or what have you, the corporations got off scot-free. In other words, what they had to pay was minimal. And there's a great documentary about the coffee incident in particular, but also how it led to all this tort reform across the country. So yeah, it's definitely worth, viewers haven't seen the documentary. I think it was originally on HBO. It's well worth checking out.
Yeah, and it's such a great example of how things get turned, an event that looks on, if you understand the totality of the event, it has some complexity and some real gravity to it. And yet that was turned into such a sort of a cliche about frivolous lawsuits. Mm-hmm. And
yeah, became a joke.
Yeah. You go a lot in the book into the history of propaganda, and as part of that, you introduce us to Edward Bernays, often referred to as the father of public relations. Could you tell us a bit about Bernays and his impact?
Yeah, so Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, where Freud devoted his life to studying human behavior and subconscious desire. Bernays applied his uncle's insights to influence public opinion through the media. So he's probably most famous for convincing women to smoke cigarettes. Before Bernays came along, only men smoked, but he linked smoking to the women's rights movement at the time. So smoking became a symbol of women's lib. Bernays convinced us that breakfast should start with bacon and eggs. He got men to wear watches, which were previously a woman's accessory, like jewelry, by convincing the military to equip soldiers with wristwatches so that they could, tell the time on the battlefield. And when hairnet sales decreased in the 1920s because women were getting bobs, short haircuts, he convinced health officials that food workers should wear hairnets to increase sales. It had nothing to do with hygiene. It was just trying to sell more hairnets for the hairnet company. And so, yeah, there's just tons of examples like this. He was a very influential figure and a bit of a character. And so,
yeah. And did he do this as like a consultant to companies? Was that how he
had his marketing? Own PR firm. He was involved even in the World War II, the Creel Committee. He was a figure for his entire life. He was involved in stuff. Interesting. One of the things, I guess, Richard Nixon, the Nixon campaign approached him, and Bernays refused to work with Nixon. He finally had to draw the line somewhere. I guess he didn't like the product Nixon was selling.
Yeah, interesting. You do a really wonderful job of introducing these different concepts like marketing, branding, publicity, and advertising. I wondered if you could read, there's a spread that, of course it has all these great illustrations, which we can't put across very well on radio, but I wondered if you would read pages 42 and 43, which is kind of giving just a definition of public relations.
Sure. So I picked one out in particular to kind of really give as an example. But yeah, as far as what is PR, It's public relations is the act of shaping a brand or company's image so that it remains favorable in the eyes of the public. It's different from advertising, which is usually paid for in like a billboard or a TV ad. Public relations is more about working the information system to get a message out. So I'll use this one as an example, which was news to me when I was researching this book. But so when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, the George H.W. Bush administration needed public support to send military aid to our major oil supplier. So the Kuwaiti government funneled money to 20 different PR firms in the U.S. to help sell the war to Americans. The PR firm Hill and Knowlton, most famous for denying, cigarettes causing cancer, led the charge, with more than 100 executives coordinating this Kuwaiti campaign, which was the most expensive foreign-funded propaganda campaign in U.S. history. So one of Bush's closest friends and advisors ran the Hill and Knowlton Washington office. So through a front group called Citizens for a Free Kuwait, Hill and Knowlton arranged media interviews for Kuwaitis. They organized rallies. They distributed tens of thousands of Free Kuwait T-shirts and bumper stickers. They set up a National Free Kuwait Day. They sent propaganda videos to media outlets who then aired them as if they were real news. Hill and Knowlton even had a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl testify before Congress about the Iraqi abuses. She was later revealed to be the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the U.S. and a member of the Kuwaiti royal family. So her testimony had been completely fabricated by Hill and Knowlton. And it was in reaction to this propaganda campaign that a writer for The Nation first coined the term post-truth way back in 1992.
Post-truth. And we find ourselves now in this post-truth era.
Yep.
Yeah.
It became the word of the year in 2016.
Wow. If you're just tuning in, my guest is Samuel Spitale. He's the author of How to Win the War on Truth, How Mistruths Are Sold, Why They Stick, and How to Reclaim Reality. Sam, I'd never heard of the concept of fast thinking and slow thinking, which comes from Nobel Prize-winning cognitive scientist Daniel Kahneman. Could you explain how that plays a role in our susceptibility to propaganda?
Sure. So the brain processes information in two ways, fast and slow, which is the simplest way to think about it. So our fast-thinking brain is very emotional, reactive, automatic, very black and white, but prone to error because, it's a very fast reflex. So I like to think of Homer Simpson, when he sees a donut, he immediately begins salivating. Or actually Homer Simpson in general,
Yes.
Very fast thinking. There's not much deliberation going on. It's reactionary. For us, if we see a red light, it immediately means we should slow down. We don't have to think about it. We know automatically. So slow thinking, on the other hand, requires effort. It's more reflective, deliberate, reliable, and it takes in the complexity of life. So think of Lisa Simpson, speaking reason and trying to solve a problem. Other examples of slow thinking would be like us trying to figure out how much we should contribute to a 401k or what the tip should be at a restaurant. Those are things that we need to slow down and think. Slow thinking requires time and effort, unlike fast thinking, which doesn't really require much effort. So therefore, it's very easy for us to slip into fast thinking as a shortcut. So we don't have to, deliberate or think too hard on something. So stereotypes are very commonly used by our fast-thinking brain. Fast and slow both serve a function, even though, again, slow thinking is more critical thinking and deliberation, but fast thinking often keeps us safe from danger. So, you see a shark fin, it means get out of the water. You see lightning, it means get out of the pool. It's very emotional, visceral reactions to stuff, our fast-thinking brain. But if we're not careful, we can rely on that too much because it's really more about feeling than actually thinking. And advertisers and influencers rely on that fast-thinking brain to kind of circumvent actual thinking and instead just get us to feel this visceral reaction. And political strategists are great at this. To me, smear campaigns, political smear ads are a great example of fast thinking, because you just so often buy into the negativity as opposed to questioning what they're saying. It's more like, oh, I knew I didn't like him anyway. It doesn't require the deliberation that we often should have when analyzing viable candidates for office.
Yeah, I remember hearing an advertising person, a person who worked in advertising, say that the purpose of advertising was not to sell you the product specifically. It was to get you to identify that product with getting all the things that you feel you want in your life. And,
yes.
Which is why they always have, beautiful people and sexual
Exactly.
appeal and excitement and happiness and togetherness is, used in advertising so much, regardless
They're
of
not getting
whether
us to think. Yeah.
Yeah.
They don't want us to think, they want us to just believe the slogans. That's why slogans are so effective, because, the slogan keeps us from thinking.
Mm-hmm.
We can just accept, if the slogan's repeated enough, we just begin to accept it, whether it's true or not.
Yeah. And that kind of fast thinking is essentially set up for black and white thinking, which you've devoted a significant discussion to in the book. You provide this great iconic graphic to showing black and white thinking. It's a circle with a negative perception in one quadrant of the circle, a positive perception in the opposite quadrant. Then you add a more nuanced perception, the middle ground, in a gray area between, in a third quadrant. But the final quadrant, which you add after some discussion, is the one you've labeled self-deception. And I found this was a really useful way to look at what happens when people are influenced by propaganda. And I wonder if you could talk about kind of the emotions associated with that spectrum of responses.
Sure. So, like for any given issue, the way I look at it as, there are positive things to this issue, there are negative aspects. There's usually a middle ground somewhere in the middle that's really not positive or negative, or maybe it's a little of both. Then there's this fourth quadrant, which is more manipulative and more misleading. So basically it's, we think something is this way, but it's really another way. And, one of the examples towards the end of the book that I use is like welfare, the welfare program, social welfare programs in general, food stamps or what have you. And, we've been conditioned to think that the welfare system is full of abuse, like welfare queens and people mooching off the system. And so, one of the tools in the book is to get you to think of it differently. Like, what are the positives of having a welfare system? It keeps people out of poverty. It helps people from falling through the cracks. Altruism. There's a lot of good things. And then the negative aspects would be, but somebody could take advantage of it. It costs tax dollars. A middle ground would be something like, it may keep people out of poverty, but it's not enough to fully lift them out of poverty if it's not well funded. So, and so the self-deception comes in more with what we've been influenced to believe, like the whole notion of the welfare queen, which was popularized in the 70s by Reagan. And the welfare queen really doesn't exist. I mean, there was a welfare queen, but she was also like a thief and a murderer and a kidnapper and all these other horrible things. So
one
her
person.
Story,
Yeah.
Right, this one person, like welfare was literally the least of her crimes. She was like a crazy person. And there have been a lot of really great books and stuff written about her, because she's a real character. But she was, just the welfare abuse was that lifted as this, kind of a slogan that was reinforced over and over. And we believe that, welfare is for lazy people mooching or something because of this myth. But the reality is welfare fraud is like a 1%. Like there's very little welfare fraud. There's way more corporate welfare fraud than there is, the poor. And so it's kind of, that self-delusion quadrant, the things that we think are true, but when you really analyze or look at the data, they're not true. And so propagandists, their goal is to kind of move us into that quadrant of self-deception, usually by focusing on the negative stories at the expense of all the other stories, because all of these are competing narratives. All of these things can be true at the same time, But if we only focus on that one welfare fraud, then, that leaves out a whole lot of complexity. And really it becomes more of a belief system, this black and white belief. Oh, there's welfare fraud. We, defund welfare. We don't need to fund it.
Yeah, and it's so interesting, to compare something like that where, welfare fraud, nationwide, if you look at the whole country, may amount to a few $1,000,000 a year. Where you look at something like the subprime mortgage collapse that happened in 2008, which cost the country trillions of dollars. And basically nobody went to jail at all. And there's, nobody was ever crying out about, financial fraud about it.
The influence machine around that, again, had us blaming poor people for buying houses they couldn't afford, as opposed to all of the people manipulating them into buying these homes. Like I feel like the movie was the movie that did a really good job by Adam McKay.
I know
illustrating.
The one. Yeah, I know the movie you mean, but I can't think of the title either.
Yeah, it's escaping me at the moment. I forget, but yeah, it's a great film because it really shows you, who you should be mad at.
Yeah,
and as a good rule of thumb, the poor are usually not the ones causing trouble in society. So anytime you're blaming down, that's usually a sign you're being manipulated into, someone shifting the blame from the people really responsible for stuff.
Yeah, it's an interesting pattern, that blaming of the least powerful for the worst things that might be happening.
Right. We see it over and over. Immigrants, poor. Look at all the legislation recently against trans people, gay and lesbians, immigrants, minorities. It's such an easy scapegoat that, it's just it's a fact of life. And so, as a rule of thumb, always be wary when someone in power is pointing to someone powerless as the fault of the root cause of something.
Yeah. And, you trace the history of propaganda in the U.S. Really, really well. And I knew that, propaganda was going strong after World War II, particularly, propaganda by corporate interests. But I didn't realize it was already well organized decades before that. Could you talk about that history a little and how the policies of the New Deal galvanized efforts by big business to control public policy?
Sure. So, there's always been this struggle between democracy and capitalism, or between government and corporations. They have competing interests by their very nature. Corporations want to make money, and government is not trying to make money. They're trying to solve problems. And most of the time, they're solving problems that corporations have caused, like, say, global warming. So when those solutions threaten corporations' profits, it becomes a conflict. So, think of the American healthcare system, which is one of the most dysfunctional health systems in the world. No other industrialized nation has a for-profit healthcare system. Everyone else has government-run healthcare, and their healthcare is basically free or greatly reduced. But in the U.S., we treat healthcare like any other business. And that's only gotten worse since the 1980s, when the Reagan administration encouraged all the nonprofit HMOs to go for profit to please Wall Street. So again, putting business over the public good. So the goal of our healthcare system is to make money, because it's a business, not help the sick. So how do you make money off the sick and dying? By charging them for services, by denying their coverage, by increasing their copays, by jacking up insulin to 8 times the cost of other countries. And so by doing this, the healthcare industry spends $240 million a year on lobbying to protect that business model. So how do they fight a no-brainer like free healthcare? How do you fight that kind of altruism? You can't rely on data or moral arguments because you're on the losing side of that argument. So the only way is to rely on propaganda, like convincing the public that healthcare is socialism, it's bad. You have to make up stuff like death panels or, government bureaucracy deciding who lives and who dies. So you have to create fear in people to make them reject a solution like public health care. And we see that pattern again and again in a unified effort to keep problems from being solved that the market has created. So when the New Deal came along and started all these public works projects that made life considerably better for the majority of Americans, the corporate class wasn't having any of it. Like rural America at the time didn't even have electricity until the New Deal, because it wasn't worth the electricity companies going into rural markets. There wasn't enough money in it. So FDR, it was one of the things he did in the New Deal. He's often credited with saving capitalism from itself, because it was pretty much, eating itself alive, which led to the Great Depression. And he's often credited with America's middle class. And that's because of all the public works programs that he did, creating infrastructure, building bridges, hospitals, protecting money in banks, establishing Social Security to keep the elderly from living on the streets, providing farm mortgages and federal housing loans and higher education, the GI Bill. Really, the list goes on and on. And so the corporate class has been trying to undermine government ever since. The notion that government isn't the solution to our problems, government is the problem, that's a century-long PR campaign by big business. As long as we think the government can't do anything right or can't solve our biggest problems, then we continue to enrich a handful of corporations and uber wealthy people instead. So it's a matter of private wealth versus the public good, or the 99% versus the 1% in, Bernie Sanders terms. Legislation can only help one of those two groups at a time, and usually at the expense of the other. So time and time again in the U.S., we seem to choose enriching a few at the expense of the many, which is why we now have levels of inequality so great that they've surpassed that of the Gilded Age.
It's stunning when you see the figures, and you've got so many great statistics and graphically presented in the book. You really get it, like it's very visceral. And I appreciate that.
Good.
And you
good to hear.
Yeah, and you touched on that event in the 30s where a group of corporate leaders tried to organize a coup to get rid of FDR, and which was foiled because they tried to get the cooperation of a former well-decorated Marine general, Smedley Butler, who's one of my American heroes. To be part of that coup, and instead of being part of the coup, he outed them, which crushed it.
Yeah, I mean, the business class, they were kind of into Nazism. Like the corporate class thought that was in their best interest. I mean, that was in the best interest of the corporate class in Nazi Germany. That's who backed Hitler. It was the military and the corporate class, because again, that's where the money is. So, yeah, again, government. This idea of government overreach threatens corporations and big business and the moneymakers. So yeah, they tried to just overthrow the government, and thankfully they were not successful. But they couldn't do it, the physical way. They just, then decided to undermine it with PR and propaganda to convince us. So this anti-government sentiment has been out there a very long time, and it's even usually often the same language. One of the things that surprised me in the book it surprised me in doing all the research. Like I was familiar with like the Red Scare and anti-communist propaganda and paranoia, but I didn't realize that it had kind of always been code for fighting labor unions, civil rights movements, suffrage. So communist hysteria was a way for the right to fight progress on the left. And a lot of that came with corporate, fighting labor unions, fighting the 40-hour work week, fighting the 8-hour work day. Anybody trying to solve those problems were branded communists.
Right. And it was easy to draw a negative association because we had totalitarian regimes in the world that were calling themselves communist and
right.
That and were again, very anti-democratic.
Right. And and again from the the corporation's point of view, how do you fight positive things? Like you can't, child labor, everybody would agree is bad. So how do you fight that? You can't. Like you have to create fear and create a villain or something so that people reject something that's better, that's good for them. And that's I feel like I hopefully do a very good job in the book of showing that is the consistent, the repeating pattern. It's always, the power structure kind of creating these myths and these lies and this propaganda to fight anything that would be viewed as progress to the rest of society.
Yeah, it's stunning how effective it is being at this time. And yet at the same time, we look at all those policies instituted through the New Deal, and right up, pretty much through that era of the 30s and 40s. Those policies stayed in effect really until the late 70s when the things started really changing. And through that period, American industry thrived. There was a growing middle class, a period of, a lot of great stuff happened during that period.
The wealth was shared. The middle class, it created like the most prosperous middle class the world had ever seen. Everyone flourished. People bought homes.
And corporations didn't disappear. They did fine.
No, they thrived. They really thrived. They did really well, and there were tons of businesses. They competed. We didn't have the lax monopoly laws like we do now, so there was more competition. Small towns thrived before big box stores, put a lot of them out of business. And so a lot of that changed, in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, you really saw
a
reversal.
The Powell memo. Yeah.
I want to come to the Powell memo, but first we're going to take a really short break, and we'll be right back after this. Don't go away. If you're just tuning in to Talk of the Bay here on KSQD, my guest is Samuel Spitale. He's the author of How to Win the War on Truth, How Mistruths Are Sold, Why They Stick, and How to Reclaim Reality. Sam, you made a reference to the Lewis Powell memo, and I wonder if you could talk about this memo that he issued in 1971 on behalf of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah, so in the 60s and the 70s, again, with there was a lot of progress going on, and the U.S. finally began limiting like air pollution and requiring seatbelts in cars and adding warning labels to cigarettes and removing lead from paint, even though the lead industry fought that for a good 50, 60 years. We were getting asbestos out of schools. We were making kids' pajamas less flammable. And so there were a lot of pro-consumer movements and pro-environment movements. And corporations didn't like that because they felt their rights were being infringed on. After all, if you can no longer pollute the local river because of environmental regulation, then you have to spend money on disposing of that toxic waste somewhere else. So they fought back in a massive way. So the Powell memo is this call to arms for the business community. They launched this coordinated effort to kind of push back. Corporate think tanks and lobbying groups ballooned. A handful of billionaires started having a greater influence on government policy to fight all of this regulation and these consumer protections. And so, they began to sell us this idea that tax cuts stimulate the economy, even though they don't, and that deregulation is bad, that regulation is bad, deregulation is good, even though regulation is what keeps our air and water clean. And we could see how those things get poisoned every time they're deregulated. Everything from the chemical spill with the trains to Flint lead poisoning. So regulation is what keeps us, healthy and able to live without the threat of all of these things impacting us in negative ways. The government tries to stop that. So anyway, these think tanks and lobbying groups started packing courts with pro-business judges over civil rights judges. The Chamber of Commerce fought organized labor to take power away from labor unions and to keep labor unions from forming. And today they are still the biggest opponent of paid maternity leave. These groups infiltrated institutions of higher learning where they pushed a pro-business agenda, often at the expense of consumers and citizens. And the list just kind of goes on and on. But overall, it was, the Powell Memo was a call to arms for the business community to fight consumer protections.
Yeah, and it seems like there's been a proliferation of organizations that do that. You did a really succinct and masterful job of dissecting that proliferation of think tanks. What's the role of think tanks in crafting policy and manipulating public opinion?
Yeah, so, think tanks kind of create their own organizations to advocate for industry, repackaging pro-business economic policies that are tailored to benefit their wealthy backers. So they're essentially PR firms disguised as scholarship, legitimizing viewpoints often at odds with reality. And they're usually funded by the industries most affected by regulation. The oil and gas industry, chemical and pharmaceutical companies, metal and machinery, rubber and plastics. So to further their agendas, they hire academic posers to churn out dubious research. They advise political candidates. They provide lawmakers with index cards of approved talking points. They testify before Congress, and they even ghostwrite our laws, because it's very easy for them to write a law, give it to whoever they're, giving the biggest campaign contributions to, and then those lawmakers will bring it up for a vote. And so they write a lot of our laws without us really knowing it. In areas of scientific consensus like climate change, they sow doubt so that once settled science becomes ripe with confusion in order to protect their profits. And the list goes on and on. The think tanks had a huge influence on the Reagan administration. They basically gave the Reagan administration like a 1,000-page wish list of everything they wanted, and the Reagan administration just did it. Cutting funding to social programs, increasing military spending to funnel money to military contractors, decreasing taxes for the wealthy but increasing taxes on the poor. The list just goes on and on.
Yeah, and it is amazing how much change there's been in that direction in the last 50 years. It's really completely changed the economic landscape. And it does seem to come back to economics. You talk about the National Association of Manufacturers in the book, which I guess was created around in the 1890s, as I recall, and maybe gone through some name changes, but basically still around. And then the National Association of Manufacturers created the Ad Council in the 1940s. And I happen to know about the Ad Council because a friend of mine in college wrote a thesis about it, and he introduced me to these campaigns they had, which were internal campaigns to corporations to unify their advertising around specific themes and promote what they called cultural hegemony. Could you talk about the Ad Council and its role in corporate PR campaigns?
So, the Ad Council, like the National Association of Manufacturers, spent millions on PR campaigns misleading the public that liberty was a result of the free market and not the other way around. So again, a very pro-business, anti-government message. And so it was really a battle of ideas, convince the public that the market is God and government is a pesky nuisance, otherwise known as market fundamentalism. But capitalism is an economic model, and democracy is a political system. So they exist independently. Capitalism relies on government because they set the rules of the game. And that's why corporations have such a huge influence on our politics, because they're essentially writing their own rules. Yeah, the Ad Council, all of these groups launched so many PR efforts trying to link, the free market to our freedoms in this country, and that's not exactly how it goes. But just billboards and ads and press releases and film reels sent to schools, and their scope is just huge, and and that's been going on for years and years and years and years.
Yeah, and it's, when we talk about the polarization that's happened in our society, it seems like a lot of that propaganda has become a cumulative factor in influencing what people believe and what they, what their kind of fast thinking reactions are to what's going on around them.
Oh yeah, completely. The Chicago School is one of the more famous examples of, infiltrating institutions of higher learning to sell a pro-corporate, anti-government agenda. A lot of the economists that influenced, the Reagan years and all the neoliberalism kind of came from there. But yeah, we've just been kind of bombarded by this market fundamentalism for so long that we take it as, fact, and it's really not. This neoliberalism, let the market do its work and it'll course correct, and that just is never really the case. If people have to be regulated in the form of laws, then we can assume that corporations probably should too.
Yeah, it seems like common sense.
Yes.
If you're just tuning in, my guest is Samuel C. Spitale. He is the author of How to Win the War on Truth, an illustrated guide to how mistruths are sold, why they stick, and how to reclaim reality. It was published by Quirk Books in 2022, and you can find the book at quirkbooks.com or your favorite local bookstore, or, of course, all the other online sources for purchasing books, if that's your preferred way to go. Sam, you used the nonprofit RAND Corporation's phrase "truth decay" to talk about what's happening. How would you describe those converging trends that define truth decay?
Sure. There's, they list 4 things. The first is an increasing disagreement about facts and data, which erodes civil discourse. And to me, this is, seen very easily in partisan media. We can't often have the right conversation because networks or internet sites are completely misleading people into believing in, focusing on the wrong problems, or that problems don't exist. A second one is a blurring of the line between fact and opinion, which leads to political paralysis. And that's another thing we see in partisan news outlets.
Mm-hmm.
Their opinion journalism, often minus the journalism.
It's cheaper than actual journalism.
It's cheaper, and to me that is the fault of kind of talk radio from when the airwaves became hyper partisan, and you had people like Rush Limbaugh just opining and complaining and demonizing. There was no there's no experts. There are no facts. It's just getting people to hate the same people you hate, and thinking that's like news. And that's not. It's entertainment entertainment that can kind of be a cancer in the way it has you looking at politics and other things. A third thing is the increasing influence of opinion over facts, creating alienation and disengagement. And that's kind of what we were just talking about. And then 4 is a declining trust in respected sources of information, which creates uncertainty. And I think we see that with, politicians lambasting liberal media or failing New York Times, or basically anytime there's news that makes them look bad or they don't want to acknowledge, they dismiss the source as, the problem, or you can't trust them. And that's, I feel like, what we're seeing now. Whereas, 20, 30 years ago, when there would be a negative news story or a negative item, if something happened, the politicians would have to acknowledge it, apologize, and so on. And in the Trump era, it's all PR. It's, there's no accountability. You just deny. And so instead of, when something happens, acknowledging it, COVID's a great example. What the administration just kept denying it or saying it's not a problem. Everything's treated like a PR problem.
Instead of a real problem.
Instead of a real problem. And so, you're just creating this sense of, oh, you can't trust these sources, because basically they're telling you something that politician doesn't want to hear. And so the denial of facts and reality, comes from a lot of it to me comes from smearing sources and voices of, wisdom or science, like trying to silence Anthony Fauci during COVID.
Right.
Because again, it made him look bad. It made the administration look bad. And so looks were more important than saving people's lives and trying to get the virus under control. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, it's interesting how much fear and uncertainty are sold. I mean, that's really the way to get people under control, is to have them living in fear and uncertainty, so that they're dependent on, certain, whether it's, talking heads on TV or certain politicians, or, talking, radio show hosts. Not myself, of course. I'm leaving myself out of this, to basically define opinions for them and tell them, what they need to do and how they should feel.
Well, and tapping into the negative emotions, appealing to people's sense of either grievance or victimhood, or the more emotional the content on social media or cable news, the more we interact with it. So that's why you have people going down rabbit holes on Facebook and YouTube, because of the algorithms. Because the more incendiary the content, the more likely to be shared, the more likely to get clicks, the more advertising dollars and revenue. Yeah, so the news that's, however inaccurate, elicits the strongest emotional response. That's what makes money.
Yeah. You say in the book, it's never been more important that we recognize propaganda for what it is. And the book is a really useful guide. But obviously, we have to be able to do this independently. We have to be able to do this for ourselves. How can we find the truth for ourselves?
Sure. So I think there are a few things. I know we're running out of time, so I'll try to be quick. I think one thing we tapped on it, we mentioned earlier, slogans. Slogans are not solutions. Slogans are sales tools. And so when they're endlessly repeated, they can become beliefs. So something to think of, let's use just the example, the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. That's a slogan. That's not a fact. It's a marketing slogan. And it was created and paid for by the NRA and developed by their advertising agency, Ackerman McQueen. So, the only thing that really stops bad guys with guns is eliminating the guns, or keeping crazy people from getting the guns, or, like every other country on earth. And so, we have to not mistake slogans for solutions, because slogans have been sold to us by someone and they're benefiting someone. There's a reason the NRA spends millions of dollars to make us think that, because they are a lobbying organization for the gun lobby, because selling guns is a business. Just the side effect of that business is lots of people die. And so that business needs us to believe that good guy myth, or else they'll stop making money. So which leads to my next strategy, identify who benefits by our beliefs. So, one of the best ways to question our ingrained beliefs is to ask, who benefits by me believing this? And why do I believe this over competing explanations? Why do we question if we can afford universal health care or free college tuition, but we don't question if we can afford wars in the Middle East, or tax cuts for corporations? Why do we question spending tax dollars on the poor, i.e. social welfare, but we don't question spending corporate welfare dollars? Who's benefiting by these things? Why do we believe marijuana is a gateway drug when access to marijuana actually inhibits the use of stronger drugs? Why do we associate Black people with violent crime and drug crimes when history shows that lynchings and race crimes have always been the other way around? And white people consume drugs, sell drugs, and die from drugs at much higher rates than Black people. But again, who's selling us these ideas, and why do we continue to buy into them? So I feel like the book is a kind of a good hand guide into why we believe these things and who sold them to us. But, we need to keep asking that question. There's a meme that goes around social media that really crystallizes this. And it goes something like, to understand any problem in society, look at who benefits by it and not who suffers from it. So who benefits by denying global warming? Only the oil and gas industry. Who benefits by denying the harm of smoking cigarettes? The tobacco industry. Who benefits from the belief that there's voter fraud? White people trying to maintain power by keeping minority votes from counting. So when we start looking at things through that filter, it definitely helps. And again, the poor and the disadvantaged are rarely behind propaganda. Only those whose money and power are threatened. Hence why we're manipulated into believing in voter fraud or fear critical race theory or why politicians red bait. It's all about power. And the poor have very little power. And so, which leads into the next thing. Identify who's trying to change the world for the better and who's resisting that change. It's usually the forces of antagonism that are up to no good, which is where the propaganda comes from. So who really benefits by banning books? Who benefits by eliminating critical race theory from classrooms? Who benefits by banning drag shows? Who benefits by, any of these things? None of those things fix a problem. So the trick here is identifying what the real problem is. And the problem is diversity, equal rights, self-expression, coming to terms with our racial history or changing social norms. Those are all positive things or a sign of progress. No one's life is actually in danger watching a drag show. Nobody's getting killed by learning about institutionalized racism. No one is hurt by reading books that challenge our beliefs.
Yeah.
But the power structure doesn't want those beliefs challenged. Therefore, it's easier to ban books than talking about all of these things.
Yeah. We have less than a minute left, and I want to give you an opportunity to tell our listeners how to get a hold of the book and how to find out more if they are ready to pursue this further into how to win the war for truth.
Sure. The book is How to Win the War on Truth, and it is available for at almost all bookstores, online, at your favorite retailers. Always encourage shopping at independent bookstores when you can, or brick and mortar stores versus online.
Sam Spitale, it's been great having you on the program, and I love the book, and I hope you have a bestseller sales on it. Thanks again.